Okay, this is the slideshow for Chapter 10 on human development. This is going to probably about 20-25 minutes long, and this is how we'll be doing things from now on. Okay, so first thing to think about with human development is kind of this basic question, the nature-nurture debate. This is something that is consistent throughout psychology, but is especially important for the people who are investigating human development. Developmental psychology is how people change over time, and it tends to be broken down into different subfields: cognitive development, emotional development, physiological development, social development, things like that. But within all of those areas, there's this ongoing uh, tension between one's genes, which is the nature, and one's environment, which is nature. And the nature nurture makes a handy tag. But it's really kind of a question of what is responsible for the behaviors we see emerge over development. Are they genetically programmed, or are they the product of the environment? Now you can imagine how things have gone in psychology. That's been back and forth between emphasizing nature versus nurture. But mostly in American psychology, I think the environment, nurture, has seen to be kind of primary in influence, and that's mostly due to the result of the behaviorists. Behaviorists like Watson and Skinner, especially, believe that all human behavior is driven through experience with the environment, and conditioning, reinforcement, and punishment are what's responsible for any given behavior at any given time. Though lately, I think the pendulum's starting to swing back the other way. And it's a very complicated question, and this is why it's phrased as debate. There's really no answer to this. It's hard to tell in research what behaviors are due to genetics and which are due to environment. For example, this is a research finding, comes from a longitudinal study. Longitudinal means that these children, these families, were followed over a period of years by the same set of researchers. And they did a variety of measurements, many different dependent variables, and observing the parents and kids and how they interacted. And one of the findings was that parents who speak, well, that's weird, not parents who speak to their babies, right? When the kids are babies, parents who speak to the babies tend to have kids, older kids, with large vocabularies. So the finding is, despite the nonsense it says on the screen, is a relationship, a correlation between the amount that a parent speaks to a nonverbal baby to the vocabulary of that child later in life when they achieve language and can talk. Right? More talking to as a baby is correlated with larger vocabularies as a toddler. That's a positive correlation. Remember, positive means increases in one are associated with increases in the other. Now that looks like it would be a nurture result, an environmental result, right? Because what comes first? Well, the parents in the environment are speaking to the babies. Those kids are raised in an environment where there's a lot of verbal activity, right? And that's what looks to be the driver on first glance. Right? It looks to be that if you're in an environment where you get talked to a lot as a baby, you will have a larger vocabulary when you're older. Well, that's complicated, and that might be our initial impression, but it's complicated because there's a lot of other things that we're kind of missing. It does look indeed to be nurture, but we got to remember that the parents, the ones who are doing the talking, providing the environment to the child, are providing the genetic material for the child. It could be that these kids have large vocabularies as toddlers because their parents have genes for high verbal ability. And it could be the genes for high verbal ability that lead the parents to speak to the babies. So it's a very complicated thing to sort out nature versus nurture. There's not too many situations where we can absolutely pull them apart. Another thing that complicates the study of human development over time is bidirectional influence. Um, because experience does influence development. Um, right, so experiences, interactions with the world influences how one grows. An example of that is teratogen exposure. Teratogens are environmental insults. They're biological insults as the baby is developing in the mother's womb. Teratogens are essentially um, things that have negative impacts on development. Some examples of teratogens are common examples are tobacco. Tobacco use by pregnant mothers tends to have negative effects on the child when they're born. Low birth weight is among them. Another teratogen is alcohol. Excessive alcohol use during pregnancy can negatively affect the fetus and the newborn. There's a syndrome, fetal alcohol syndrome, that results due to excessive alcohol use during pregnancy. Children with FAS, fetal alcohol syndrome, tend to have what we call dysmorphic features. They even though they're from different families, they tend to look alike. They tend to have flattened noses and extended kind of foreheads. But there's also cognitive effects. They have difficulties with math and reading and thinking, and they can have memory difficulties, and they can have attentional difficulties later in life. So certainly the experience, the things one encounters in the world, experience, influences how development proceeds. It's also true, though, that development influences experience. How one grows biologically impacts how you can deal with the world. For example, myelinization. Myelinization is the process by which a fatty covering grows on the axon of neurons. You might want to go back to the chapter on biology and neurons to review this. But if you remember in the picture, the myelin, I made a comment, look like hot dog buns on the axon of the neuron. What myelin does is speed up neural transmission. So a myelinated axon will transmit the action potential to the terminal buttons faster than a non-myelinated axon. How does that influence experience? Well, speed of thought is a major determinant in cognitive processing. The faster one can process information, the more can be done, and the more the system can handle more information. Think of chunking. Remember we talked about chunking last semester, right? Chunking is a strategy by which we can go from 7 plus or minus 2 digits to maybe 80 digits, like those people in the experiment we discussed. By rapidly processing the information into chunks, they were seemingly able to expand their digit span capacity. So it's hard to separate when we see a behavior is how much of it is due to the experience and how much is due to development, because these two things are not happening in isolation. Experience and biological development are happening together. There's always interactions between the two. The chapter is divided into several different sections. We're going to talk about cognitive development. I found that of all the things in the chapter, cognitive development is probably the most useful thing in this chapter for Psych 100 students. Cognitive development is concerned with how babies grow to have the mental abilities of adults. It is important for future teachers. It's important for anyone who might be working with kids professionally, perhaps social work, or even exercise science or school health. And certainly important for anybody who might be thinking about having children or will be around children in some way in the future. foremost researcher in cognitive development is Jean Piaget, and Piaget lived from about the 20s. He did his work from the 20s to about the 80s. He was working well into old age, and he was a very thorough and methodical researcher and thinker. There's an anecdotal story that at some point Einstein and Piaget were at a conference, and Einstein, looking to make small talk with Piaget, said something like, "Well, Piaget, how do children think about time?" Because time, of course, was Einstein's big thing with relativity and astrophysics. And Piaget just kind of nodded and said, "Well, I'll have to think about that," and then wandered off. And the result was 5 years later, Piaget published a book on how he conceived children experience and process time. So he was a pretty dedicated and thorough scholar of definitely an old school variety. What's also interesting about Piaget is his theory has captured very well how it looks like children think and grow over time. And it's especially amazing because he studied his own children. Now, that's not typically what someone would be recommended to do, because parents have an association with their children. It's generally a bad idea to study anybody you know. Because you have preconceived expectations about them. You've got a history, a past, and that makes it hard to be objective. But Piaget was so methodical and systematic that it doesn't seem to really have been a problem with him, and even served to be an an advantage. Since it's his own children, he had almost unlimited access. He could study them nearly 24 hours a day. I don't think he sat there and watched them when they slept, but certainly every waking hour they're available for him to observe and make conclusions about. If someone were to bring their child into my lab so I could study their memory, at best I may be seeing that child for an hour. So the benefit of studying your own children is kind of seeing them in all these different situations, how they react and think. Piaget, in observing his children, explained cognitive growth in terms of two processes. These processes were complementary. They kind of worked together and kind of captured at a broad sense how children go about processing information in their world. The first process is assimilation. Assimilation is interpreting experiences in terms of what one already knows. Now, the phrase there is existing mental structures. Piaget called these schemas. And he believed that as we're interacting with the world, we're forming these mental structures, ideas, these schemas about how the world works and what things mean. And we use this in interpreting experiences. So assimilation is kind of taking what's out in the world and making it fit, understanding it in terms of what one knows. Essentially, assimilation is applying what we know to new situations. As an example, consider a little boy who has a pet at home and learns that pet is a doggy. And in that child's mind, a schema, right, what makes a doggy is having 4 legs and fur. So that term, that schema, that idea, right, is exaggerated, and the child calls all 4-legged animals doggies. Sees a cat, doggy. Sees a deer on the side of the road walking in the woods, there's a doggy. They go out to the farm, there's a cow, there's a horse, they're all doggies. The child is taking what they know and applying it to what they encounter. These things all have 4 legs and fur, and they all must be doggies. Now, linguists would call this a generalization. Piaget's not so much talking about language or generalizing. He says this is how they think. They interpret the world in terms of what they already know. Now, the advantage of that is they know things, and they're going to be right sometimes. Some things are going to be doggies. But the disadvantage is that it's not always correct, right? Our idea about the world is not always the correct one. The second process is accommodation. Accommodation means changing. And the process of accommodation, according to Piaget, was changing the mental structures to explain new experiences. At some point, Piaget says the new experiences can't really be explained by the existing knowledge, and that existing knowledge, schemas, grow, they change. Think of an atom, a molecule dividing, a skin cell dividing into two. It becomes something different as a result of experience. And for Piaget, this is how we add knowledge, right? When we encounter new situations, eventually it dawns on us we need to change knowledge. It may not even be a conscious dawning, but we add to knowledge to explain new situations. Continuing with that example of the child from the previous slide, right? At some point, that child is going to learn to call some four-legged animals horsies, right? That their knowledge has to accommodate this difference. So a horsey might be something bigger than a dog, right? Horsey might be something that's big enough to ride around on, right? Doggies, you can't ride around on them. But the knowledge grows and splits into two where there used to be just one. The way to think about this is, right, the knowledge adapts or accommodates new information. Piaget believed that kids went on this process. Generally, assimilation was the steady state. Kids went through the world assimilating, using what they know, and after a period of time, they're collecting evidence, they're kind of growing. At some point, there's accommodation, there's growth in their knowledge. Behind all of this, Piaget believed in nature. He said accommodation, growth can't happen if the brain is not ready for it. He said the brain had to be properly prepared, like a field in the springtime, in order for growth, for new knowledge to occur. So there was kind of this idea of biological maturation. And for Piaget, this is why the process of development is spread out over time, why human babies don't come out with the ability to do algebra or astrophysics or even statistics or intro psychology. Their brains just are not ready to handle that amount of information. Piaget's cognitive development theory is known as a stage theory because he says these periods of assimilation kind of form almost steady states where there's kind of more similarity from moment to moment or day to day than periods of change. But at some point there's a boundary that's crossed and they kind of get to a new stage. Now some people see this as kind of stairs. There's a flat period and then a very strong radical uprise to the next stage in terms of ability, but other people see it like physical growth, that it's a lot more gradual day to day. It's just not noticeable until a period of time has passed. So we're going to go through Piaget's stages. We'll go through them by name. There's going to be a lot of videos here. I think the videos will work. We'll see how that works, but the videos are also posted on Blackboard for you to look at. Piaget's first stage was the sensory motor stage, and that's blended into one word. And I remember reading about this when I was in intro psych, and I read about it before I went to class, and in my head I read it as sensory motor. It seemed weird to have an I in the middle of the word like that, so I really emphasized it in reading. And I went to class and learned sensory motor, and kind of felt silly about it, but it has been a way for me to remember it. Piaget believed the sensory motor stage was from birth to about 2 years old. Now, one of the things where his stage theory seems to have some fuzzy parts is these age ranges. Everybody seems to accept that the stages all occur in the same order, but it's hard to say when a child moves from one stage to the other. but on average it seems most kids are out of this stage by about 2 years old. In the sensory motor stage, babies are learning to coordinate their sensory input with their movement. They're learning to calibrate their brain, and this is the sensory motor part. This isn't named by accident. They're learning to calibrate their brain with their movement. They're learning what it feels like to move, what it feels like to touch things, what it feels like to smell things, and to coordinate their inner experience with their outer experience. Right? They're starting from scratch, and they've got to figure everything out. With babies, you see their physical movement is very difficult when they're little. They can move their arms all around, but they're not very fine with their movements. They can swing their arms back and forth, and if we're in class, you'd see me swinging my arms over my head, but to kind of touch their nose is a very difficult thing for them. So this is what they're learning to do. They're learning to control their thought. They're learning to control their movement. For Piaget, the milestone, what marked kind of the end of this stage, was that symbolic thought emerges. At some point, the brain evolves to the point, grows to the point that the individual can use mental symbols to represent the world. That they realize that things, and it's maybe a realization that they can have these schemas, these concepts for things in their world, even though they may not be physically present. Think about it, right? These little kids, they're born, their world is what is right in front of them, what they see and what they smell and what they hear. And it takes some while before these things can be represented mentally. And once it can be represented mentally, Piaget thought that was a milestone, because that meant that they could think about it in some way. Okay, this slide has the first video, and I think these will work. Now, as a reminder, there's the name. You can find it on the website by this name, so you can go back and review these films all the time. I'm not hearing any sound, but that's okay. But there you see the little baby. She's looking at a jiggly toy there, and then they put the green cloth in front of it, and the baby looks away. Let's take another look at that. Right? Interested in the toy, hears the toy, sees the toy. You see the baby's attending to it, and then it gets covered up, occluded by the cloth, and the baby looks away. Piaget used this concept. You say that little baby there did not have object permanence. To Piaget, the idea, the concept, the realization that objects exist when they can no longer be experienced is the milestone. That is when you know symbolic thought has emerged. If the child shows evidence of knowing something exists when it's not physically present, that's object permanence. Now in that video, that little baby lacked object permanence. She looked to be a couple months old, maybe about 4 months old. She didn't look for the hidden toy, didn't hunt for it with her eyes. Right? Whereas when the toy's there, she pays attention to it. When it is simply hidden by a cloth, she kind of looks away. It no longer exists for her. You can put a toy under a cloth, and older kids might reach for it or not reach for it. If they don't reach for it, that means that they do not have object permanence. But as they get older, more kids show this ability. They show evidence that things exist in their world. And by about 18 months, most kids will hunt around for a toy that has been hidden. They master the concept. So how do we know they have object permanence, even when they can't reach and they can't talk? Well, you look at their behaviors. You watch their eyes, see if they look for something. You see if they reach for something. You look for expressions of surprise if something happens that is maybe unexpected, and that shows that they can think about it. All right, we're about 25 minutes in. The next slideshow will pick up from here.